On the 15th of September 1925, Enrique Chaim Bejarano, chief rabbi of the Republic of Turkey, renounced all political authority of the national rabbinate. Effective the following August, it would no longer be tax-exempt, it would no longer be entitled to collect revenue from the Jewish community. Every Jewish school, synagogue, library, hospital, and charity would be an independent entity answerable only to the national government in Ankara. A decade earlier, such a decision would have been unthinkable, but there was something much bigger going on. Rather than Rabbi Bejarano, the renunciation was written and presented by a coalition of secular Jewish intellectuals led by the historian and linguist Avram Galanti.
Seeing that the political and general order of the Turkish Republic is completely based on the separation of religion from things of this world, we as Jewish Turks express the view that we will benefit from secular laws and arrangements, as well as from all other civil laws which the Republican government intends to promulgate in reference to personal status and to family laws, and we present to the government the feelings of our unwavering gratitude.
How did this happen? The Ottoman Empire was dead, to begin with. It had been in decline for centuries, and while incremental reforms had come every few decades, they were invariably followed by an authoritarian backlash. The most recent example had been the Young Turk Revolution, which had begun as a secular, democratic, and multicultural movement, but quickly metastasized into a brutal military dictatorship under the informal rule of the three pashas, leading the empire into the First World War and committing multiple genocides. For those unaware, this didn't work out for them. By October 1918, about 3 million Ottoman citizens had been killed, mostly at the hands of their own government, and the majority of Ottoman territory was under foreign occupation. Late that month, the government surrendered, the Allies occupied Constantinople, and the three pashas were indicted for treason, fled the country, and were gradually hunted down and killed. Unlike in Germany or Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans still had an emperor, who immediately had the ruling CUP purged and convinced the Allies that he'd do just about anything to keep his position. The Allies weren't actually concerned about the monarchy, but Mehmed's fear of losing the throne gave them enormous leverage. Though the precise details weren't decided, it was already clear that the Ottomans would have to cede even more territory than they had lost in the war. What they couldn't have known is that all of this was about to become irrelevant. It would be wrong to ascribe the Ottoman defeat in the First World War to a single offensive, but the Battle of Megiddo comes pretty close. In late September of 1918, British and Commonwealth forces conducted a rapid-fire encirclement of northern Palestine, killing or capturing almost all of the Ottoman 4th, 7th, and 8th armies. The 7th Army suffered a particularly brutal fate, nearly wiped out by British bombers as they tried to retreat across the Jordan. But astonishingly, their commanding general, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, escaped. Born in the now Greek city of Salonika, Kemal Pasha had participated in the Young Turk Revolution but was repeatedly marginalized for his increasingly radical views, such as his militant secularism, opposition to the monarchy, support for universal suffrage, and eventually some tepid criticism of the Armenian genocide. But as one of the empire's only competent generals, he could only be marginalized so much. Over the course of the war, he helped lead the Ottoman army to victory at Gallipoli before being sent on a doomed mission to hold the Allies back in Palestine. By some miracle, he avoided the fate of most of his men at Nablus and organized what was left of the Yildirim army group to slow the Allied advance and keep them from entering Anatolia. Kemal Pasha came out of the war more popular than ever and even more radicalized, which put him in an unusual position to organize what little remained of an independent Turkey to resist both the Allies and the Sultan. Following the Armistice of Mudros, Kemal Pasha followed the letter of the armistice, but not the spirit. In order to relinquish the Ottoman army's weapons, he did so by giving them out to the local population, who quickly formed democratic military councils. 6 months later, the Greeks invaded Anatolia to stake their claim on the majority Greek region of Ionia, the military councils launched into action, and the Turkish War of Independence began. Over the summer, the military councils merged into the Association for Defense of Rights of Anatolia and Rumelia, denouncing the Constantinople government, demanding a united, independent Turkey with equal rights for all adult citizens, and establishing its own parliament in the small city of Ankara. By mid-1920, any part of the country that wasn't under foreign occupation had come under control of the revolutionaries. So when the Ottoman government signed the Treaty of Sèvres that August, neither the government nor the treaty itself had any authority. Much of the revolution's success was due to good timing. Unlike, say, Hungary, Kemal and his associates only fully took up the struggle after the Paris Peace Conference had ended, at a time when the Allies were no longer able or willing to take serious military action. In December 1920, the Kemalists signed a treaty forcing Armenia to renounce their promised territory to the west. Soon after, Armenia was taken over by the Soviets, who began showering the rebels with leftover guns and ammunition from their civil war. Around this time, Italy switched sides and began supporting the Kemalists, leading France to recognize the Republic and renegotiate the border with their mandate for Syria. During the Great War, the loudest advocate for de-Ottomanization had been the United States, but political winds had shifted towards isolationism. The British were similarly war-weary and only became more so as the peace process dragged on. This left Greece as the only allied nation willing to fight, and while they initially advanced deep into Anatolia, the revolutionaries finally turned them back at the Sakarya River. Over the next year, they pushed the Greeks back to the sea, burning the major city of Smyrna and expelling or massacring hundreds of thousands of Greeks and Armenians. Around this time, the Ankara government made an arrangement with the Greek government and a League of Nations commission led by British diplomat John Hope Simpson to relocate most of Anatolia's remaining Greek population to the Greek state in exchange for receiving most of Greece's ethnic Turkish and Greek Muslim population in what's been called the legalization of ethnic cleansing. The following year, the League of Nations recognized Ankara as Turkey's legitimate government, and the Ottoman Empire was no more. With all that out of the way, according to the census of 1927, the Republic of Turkey had a total Jewish population of 81,872. The majority lived in the former capital Constantinople, now renamed Istanbul, where they made up about 6% of residents. During the Great War, most Jews in Anatolia and Rumelia had continued to support the Ottomans, which put them in contrast to most of their Greek and Armenian neighbors, as well as their fellow Jews in Iraq and Palestine. This pattern continued during the War of Independence. In turn, they'd avoided most of the atrocities of the war. Even the Jewish quarter of Smyrna had been spared, and former Chief Rabbi Chaim Nachum had been one of Turkey's delegates to the Lausanne Peace Conference. Following Smyrna's destruction, a local Jewish lawyer had the opportunity to ask Field Marshal Kemal where he stood on the Jewish question. Kemal responded that to be a Turk was no longer defined by blood or religion, only allegiance to the idea of Turkey. During the first year of the Republic, Kemal took a surprisingly conservative approach. An amnesty was declared for surviving perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, allowing them to return without fear of prosecution, and though the monarchy was abolished, the former imperial family continued to hold the title of Caliph, the ceremonial figurehead of Islam. The new republic was conspicuously a one-party state, and while Jews and Christians had served in the Ottoman parliament as far back as the 1870s, the Grand National Assembly remained entirely Muslim well into the 1930s. From the outside, it might have looked like Turkey was taking a step backward, but change was in the air. In March 1924, the Caliphate was abolished, ending the last vestige of the monarchy. A month and a half later, the Assembly ratified a new constitution. Unlike most European republics, the new system included a US-style executive presidency, with Kemal as its first president. Though Islam remained in place as the state religion, this provision was repealed just 4 years later, and from the very beginning, freedom of religion was sacrosanct. Similarly, though Turkish was enshrined as the sole official language, the constitution created a legal definition of Turk that encompassed all citizens irrespective of language or culture. But this wasn't the end of the road for Kemalism. Far from it. The new constitution was only the opening salvo of a decade of ambitious reforms to transform Turkish society so completely that nothing like the empire could ever exist again. And one of the chief symbols of that empire had been the power of religion. Though Jews had enjoyed full citizenship in the empire since 1839, Jewish religious authorities enjoyed far-reaching autonomy under what was known as the millet system. The system hadn't gone unchanged over the centuries. Until 1856, the rabbinate could still arrest and punish members of the community for violating religious law. But even after the First World War, the millet system remained in effect across much of West Asia. The British made it an integral part of their mandates in Palestine and Iraq, even as many within those countries wished to abolish it, and the new Turkish Republic was no different. In addition to guaranteeing equal citizenship for all minority populations still living within their new borders, the Treaty of Lausanne kept the Milits on life support. While religious courts could still officiate weddings and divorces, they no longer had a monopoly on them. The rabbinate also lost the right to levy taxes on kosher butchers, making it impossible to secure funding for schools, hospitals, or synagogues. Alongside the new constitution, the government immediately dissolved the Islamic courts, and in an interview with the New York Herald, Kemal explicitly stated that the Christian patriarchates and Jewish rabbinate should do the same. Obviously, many Christians and Jews resented the power of their religious leaders and were eager to see it taken away. But that wasn't enough to make it happen. Far more important was the rabbinate's financial desperation, the coercive power of the reforms, and the rising tide of anti-Semitism. Generally speaking, Turkish Jews weren't only a religious minority, but a linguistic one. While fluency in Turkish wasn't unheard of, the mother tongue for the vast majority was Ladino, a Romance language derived from early modern Spanish and written using the Hebrew alphabet. For Kemal and his government, this posed a major problem. Alongside secularization, a major pillar of the Kemalist cultural program was Turkification, uniting the country through a common language. This effort peaked in 1928, when the Arabic alphabet was discarded in favor of a Latin-derived script in order to increase literacy, while the government funded a propaganda campaign to discourage the use of minority languages in public. The reasons for this weren't just cultural, but economic. Insofar as the Ottoman Empire had had a middle class, only a small minority had been ethnically Turkish. Instead, the overwhelming majority of educated professionals and business owners had been Greek, Armenian, or Jewish. For obvious reasons, the government's main approach to Turkifying the middle class was to expand it by stimulating the economy through economic reforms and public works projects. But that was still accompanied by overt pressure to impose Turkish on minority populations, as well as discriminatory employment policies that resulted in the dismissal or blackballing of Jewish lawyers, teachers, civil servants, military officers, and executives in state-owned businesses. The campaign against Ladino in particular exploited a loophole in the Treaty of Lausanne. Just as the treaty ensured the continuation of the Milits, so too did it guarantee Jews, Greeks, and Armenians the oral use of their own language before the courts. However, taking a literal interpretation of this provision, the language of the Jews wasn't Ladino, but Hebrew, the traditional language of Jewish law, which most Turkish Jews didn't speak. Rather than even attempt to find enough Hebrew-speaking teachers, most Jewish schools switched the language of instruction to Turkish, leading to an influx of Muslim teachers, and by the late 1930s, virtually all distinct aspects of Jewish education had disappeared from Jewish schools, leading most parents to simply enroll their children in state schools. As with secularization, most Jewish intellectuals didn't consider this a bad thing. Under the Ottomans, primary and secondary education had been the sole responsibility of religious authorities, so most Jews had never enjoyed the opportunity to learn Turkish. Those who could speak the language were mostly university graduates, many of whom had since become evangelists for Turkification. David Fresco, editor of the Ladino newspaper El Tiempo, had been a passionate advocate for Turkification since the 1890s. Beginning in 1928, Avram Galanti suggested following the example of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, a French Jewish organization whose schools in Turkey had created a situation where more Turkish Jews could speak French than Turkish. But that had taken only 50 years, so perhaps Turkish could be adopted just as quickly. Rabbi Bejarano suggested that it could take as little as 10 years. And journalist Moise Cohen published his own version of the 10 Commandments that included abandoning Jewish schools, praying in Turkish, and even changing one's name. True to his word, Cohen soon adopted the name Munis Tekinalp and founded the National Culture Association, the first of several Jewish clubs dedicated to the Turkish language. That isn't to say there wasn't pushback. Minority activists occasionally staged protests against Turkification, but most of the pushback came from the opposite direction. While Kemal and his Republican People's Party conceptualized themselves as center-left social democrats, Turkification also found common cause with some Islamists, as well as adherents to a pan-Turkic supremacist ideology known as Turanism. By applying continuous pressure on the Jewish community to renounce their religious and language privileges, Kemal had unintentionally given cover to the far right to demonize Turkish Jewry. Generally speaking, these voices utilized anti-Semitism as a means to reconcile their own nationalist ideologies with their opposition to the nationalist project. In 1925, the right-wing newspaper Tevhidi Evkyar attributed President Kemal's secular agenda to the machinations of his Jewish dentist Sami Günzberg, whom the paper also accused of being a German spy. Not long after, Tevhidi Evkyar was shut down due to its Islamist leanings, while Dr. Günzberg sued for libel and eventually won. And of course he did. In my opinion, Tevhidi Evkyar lost credibility the moment they insinuated that people listened to their dentists. Instead, the Islamist press moved on and started accusing Kemal himself of secretly being Jewish, and since that isn't defamatory, it's been the prevailing conspiracy theory ever since. But the most bizarre instance came in February 1926, when the pro-government newspaper Cumhuriyet reported that 300 Jews had sent a message pledging their loyalty to King Alfonso XIII of Spain in celebration of Columbus Day. Other newspapers in Istanbul soon repeated this claim, but no evidence was ever found, and the alleged list of 300 Jews was never disclosed by any of the papers reporting on it, so this was a rumor at best. And if you know your history, the idea that Turkish Jews would harbor secret loyalties to a foreign crown that had expelled their ancestors 423 years earlier, that they would openly pledge their allegiance when it was most politically dangerous to do so, and that they'd do so for a holiday at least partly celebrating their expulsion purely on the grounds that their native language was derived from Spanish, is absurd on its face. But even if you don't know the history, imagine trying to make people afraid of Spain in 1926. A delegation led by Galanti and Bejarano convinced Ankara that the report was false, with the interior minister proclaiming,
"Even if it were true that certain isolated persons sent a message of greeting to Spain, the government is convinced that the Turkish Jews collectively could teach loyalty to other elements in the country."
But what began that winter could no longer be contained. A promised government investigation into the origins of the disinformation campaign never materialized, and Turkey's anti-Semitic element moved from the newspapers to the streets. In Izmir, riots broke out when a Muslim soldier murdered a Jewish friend who owed him 500 lira, or about £5. At the same time, vandals broke into a synagogue in Üsküdar and destroyed its Ark and Torah scroll. A year later, a disgraced former Ottoman aristocrat named Osman Ragip began stalking a 22-year-old Jewish insurance employee named Elza Niego. Despite being 30 years older, Muslim, still illegally married to 2 estranged wives, and completely repellent to Niego, Ragip continued to harass her and was even arrested for attempted kidnapping. Upon hearing that Niego was engaged, Ragip waited for her outside her workplace and stabbed her to death. Seeing the murder of a young woman in broad daylight, a crowd of locals, including Niego's own brother, attempted to kill Ragip. They were stopped by police, who took him into protective custody, and he ultimately spent the rest of his life in a mental institution. And though the police had been quick to arrive at the scene, they left Niego's body uncovered for 3 hours as they waited for forensics, which was highly unusual at the time and contrary to the wishes of Niego's mother. Enraged by the police's disrespect of the corpse and their conspicuously light treatment of Ragip, thousands of Istanbul's Jews joined Niego's funeral procession, which just happened to run into a car carrying Safet Arikan, Secretary General of the Republican People's Party. Quickly, the procession devolved into a political protest, with attendees chanting, "We want justice," which was enough for Chief Prosecutor Nazif Bey to have 9 of the attendees arrested for violating a new and controversial statute against insulting Turkishness. In the ensuing trial, police alleged that the defendants had been armed and had conspired beforehand to turn the funeral procession into a riot, but were unable to produce any evidence and were contradicted by witness testimony. They were acquitted on the 24th of September, though the prosecution unsuccessfully appealed the decision and expanded the investigation by searching the local chapter of B'nai B'rith on suspicion of having possibly contributed to the funeral expenses. At the same time, citizen activists organized mass demonstrations around the country calling for a boycott of Jewish businesses, vandalizing displays of the Hebrew alphabet, and demanding protection money from rabbis. Newspapers like Cumhuriyet issued threatening editorials accusing Jews of ingratitude to the Turkish nation, while the government boasted of the acquittal to the foreign press as evidence that Turkey didn't have an anti-Semitism problem. Increasingly disillusioned with the CHP, Jewish voters in 1930 flocked to the Liberal Republican Party, the opposition group formed by President Kemal in preparation for the return of multi-party democracy, only for Kemal to shut it down when it became a magnet for minorities and religiously conservative Muslims. In their place, Kemal authorized 30 seats to be reserved for independent candidates in the next election. If the Turkish Revolution began in 1919, I would argue that it ended in 1934, when Kemal's government issued its last major wave of reforms. That June, the Assembly passed a law requiring all Turkish citizens to adopt a surname, though ironically most Christians and Jews already had surnames. President Kemal took on the name Atatürk, meaning Father of the Turks. In November, the Assembly abolished all titles of nobility and religious distinction, like Pasha or Bey or Effendi or even Haji. This was soon followed by a ban on the wearing of religious clothing in public. The Constitution was amended to give women the vote, and the quotas were lifted on independent candidates for the Assembly, which would lead to the election of Jewish and Christian deputies for the first time since the Empire. But before any of these, the Assembly passed one of the most draconian laws in the history of the Republic. Back in 1927, Kurdish separatists in the southeast had declared independence as the Republic of Ararat, and though that rebellion had been defeated in 1931, the government began looking at ways to make such an uprising impossible in the future. The end result was Law 2510, which made it legal for the government to redistribute the population in such a way as to eliminate majority-minority enclaves within Turkey's borders, either by forcibly relocating ethnic Turks to the periphery or by forcibly relocating minorities to the interior. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Nazi Party had been in power for a little over a year. The Nuremberg laws were still to come, but the party had already undertaken a purge of Jews, political opponents, and non-Aryans from the military, civil service, and professions like law and education. Deprived of their livelihood, many such people took refuge in other parts of Europe, including Istanbul, where the Turkish government, seeing an opportunity to improve their global image, gladly accepted them and even helped them resume their careers. This is important to our story for two reasons. First, at the time this was happening, the government was still in the process of removing linguistic minorities from their own civil service and education sectors in order to achieve demographic parity, resulting in a bizarre situation where the government actively subordinated the interest of Turkish Jews to that of non-Turkish Jews. Second, the anti-Semitism problem in Turkey hadn't gone away. If anything, the rise of the Nazis encouraged it. Even the government turned a blind eye to many of its own propagandists inveighing against the Jewish communities in Izmir and Edirne under the pretense of protesting economic inequality. But the most egregious offenders were the Tyrannists. Their propaganda suggested going even further than the Nazis already had and doing to the Jews what they had already done to the Armenians. Following the passage of the resettlement law, Jews in the city of Çanakkale began receiving anonymous letters claiming that Prime Minister İsmet İnönü had ordered their expulsion. These letters probably originated with far-right youth clubs who expected the Jews to either leave without question or lash out in the press. Instead, Jewish community leaders recognized the letters for the forgeries they were and wrote directly to the Prime Minister's office to alert him. If this had been Istanbul, they probably would have gotten a response, but it wasn't. So, whether due to willful negligence or simple bureaucratic gridlock, they never heard back. Dissatisfied with the failure of their provocations, the Tyrannists escalated to violence on the 3rd of July, not only in Çanakkale but Edirne, Kırklareli, and Tekirdağ. But they knew that they probably couldn't get away with murder, so rather than turning into a massacre, the Thracian pogrom focused on destroying Jewish homes and businesses in order to force them to leave the area for good. This was a partial success. On the 5th, government forces moved in and restored order, but one Jewish resident was dead and most of Thrace's Jewish population was left with nothing. Over the next year, most of them relocated to Istanbul, and many of those left Turkey entirely, with the majority of emigrants fleeing to Spain. In 1927, the Republic of Turkey had a total Jewish population of 81,872. Yet, despite a healthy birth rate and a small surge of refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, by 1935, the Jewish population had actually fallen to 78,730. Although the vast majority of Jews in the country supported the nationalist project, both the ideology of the ruling CHP and its reactionary opponents had created a hostile environment that made life increasingly difficult for them, especially for those living outside of Istanbul. The government's relationship with minorities was fraught and often contradictory, and their ability to ensure the safety of minority allies was painfully limited. President Mustafa Kemal Atatürk died on the 10th of November 1938, the day after Kristallnacht in Germany. By this time, it was clear to the world that the peace arranged at Paris had failed. Another world war was coming. The only question was how soon. And Turkey's primary objective, like that of many European countries, was to avoid becoming involved. 4 centuries prior, the Ottoman Empire had welcomed the Jewish people. Ataturk had renewed that welcome when he established the Republic, and the government continued to maintain that anti-Semitism was not a Turkish problem. Yet the future of Turkish Jewry had never seemed so uncertain. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.